I've been a radio disc jockey for about 4 or 5 years now, but I worked at the radio station since I was 16. I answered a lot of mail and delivered a lot of messages to the various employees that made up the tiny building they ran out of. I was like their pet that they watched grow up to become a DJ himself. However, back when I was first hired, I was always shaken up by a man who was known as Mr. Sellers. He was not the boss by any means, but he was supposedly very vital to the production of the radio. They gave him an office without any windows, and they gave him a title like the creative director, or something that I'm sure wasn't a real title at all. You don't have to know much about him. He was an eccentric man. His family constantly worried about him, and therefore he had his own personal assistant, who was actually a psychiatric nurse hired by his rich family to make sure he didn't hurt himself or something. Mr. Sellers was always paranoid. He spoke about governmental spies, recording devices, and surveillance. He trusted no one and could hardly look me in the eyes, even though I was just a teenager then. He had an 8mm camera and a cassette tape recorder within arm's reach at all times. In meetings, he would lie his head down and played a loud tape that sounded like some heavily degraded lo-fi music right into his ear. I could be across the room and still get a headache from it, but the man seemed immune. In fact, it seemed to calm him down. He was seriously mentally ill, but he had some fantastic ideas. They kept him on because it would cost them more to replace him or to lose him. Now, if you think this is some story about some psycho who ends up killing his family and wearing their skin or something, you're wrong. This is not some awful depiction of the unfortunate mental illness. This is just something that happened to me that sends chills up my spine when I think about it. So, anyways, I worked for quite some time answering mail, but even though I was usually in a quiet room full of envelopes, I was not too far away from the daily drama of Mr. Sellers. He had many different moods. Sometimes he would not leave his office, and he wouldn't let anyone in. He would write out his daily contribution on a notebook and slide it under the door. Other times he was all over the building. He recorded on his camera and laughed a lot. It was like everyday situations made him laugh. He could ask, "What time is it?" and someone could have replied, 2:30. He would have been on the floor laughing as if it was the best joke in history. There were times when he would refuse to eat because he thought the food was rotten, when it clearly wasn't. He would sometimes refuse to drink water because he thought that they were pumping gasoline into the water system. He wouldn't sleep for days because he thought people videotaped him while he was asleep. He collapsed to exhaustion 3 times and dehydration once. Twice he was escorted out of the building by police, kicking and screaming, then was unseen while he stayed in a mental hospital for 6 weeks at a time. He wasn't creepy, he was just some guy who we all sort of pitied. However, while all the talk of the surveillance and elaborate conspiracies about loss of privacy were happening, people in the office felt ill at ease. It didn't help that Mr. Sellers waved his camera around all the time. It wasn't always like that, only when it was quiet. The times that Mr. Sellers were away at the hospital, or when he was refusing to leave the office. That was when it felt like one was not alone. Then, one day we started having broadcasting errors. We would be on air and then suddenly cut out. We would have very low quality sound from either minutes or hours. Then there would be silence, a loud beep, and perfect sound once again. This began happening very frequently, but no one could identify the problem. Someone suggested that it was possible there were two things trying to be broadcasted at once, but no one was running anything other than our programs. It would happen so frequently that listeners began noticing it. We began having the reputation that we had low-quality broadcasting when that wasn't true at all. After about 3 months of being in the dark as to what the problem was, one evening at about 3:47 in the morning, it happened again. Rick, one of our disc jockeys at the time, who usually ran the late nights and the early mornings, was playing music. No one usually listened at that time of morning, so we ran a few advertisements and a heavy amount of cheap music. Then, all of a sudden, the sound became distorted. Rich had no idea, but Mrs. Jennings, who was listening to it, could hear the sound cut into a loud static. The static had a high pitch to it and an eerie undertone. If you listened closely, you could hear a man talking in a low, emotionless voice. Mrs. Jennings made everyone who was present listen, including the janitor, and they all couldn't understand where it was coming from. No one was in the office at all, and everyone who stood in the room listening to the weird transmission. Mrs. Jennings started recording it onto a blank tape. She wasn't recording when it first came on, but afterwards she did. The voice stopped, cleared his throat, and then went silent. There was no voice, just static. Then there was a very faint and then another. Oh. That part was only heard after the recorded tape played back. The static stopped and went to solid silence. Then, after the sound of a telephone dial and a click, the music began playing. When I came in that night, they made me listen to the tape and they told me what happened. They made our tech specialist listen to it, and he began to suspect that someone could be hijacking the broadcast signal. He said it was possible that whoever was doing it could be causing the problems we have been having, and that this person was unsuccessful before. Still, it was a big deal. Even if it was at 3 in the morning, it was illegal, and it was causing us a lot of problems, so we decided to see if it would persist. For the longest time, it didn't. We continued as normal, and the problems stopped. This continued for months, until one day, just around noon, the signal cut out and became clear white noise. Then, the sound of a tape recorder started playing, of someone speaking being played backwards. There were different sounds, faint voices, and a similar sounding one that sometimes whispered and sometimes spoke in a concerning tone. It was all played backwards, so we had no idea what it said. We were able to catch most of it on our own recording, and when we played it backwards, thus making it play normally, we were shocked to hear the familiar voice of Mr. Sellers, and the other voices were snippets of conversations with him, recordings of past broadcastings, and what sounded like the recording device being set next to a television set during a film. Mr. Sellers was immediately questioned about the incidents, and Without blinking, he admitted to the broadcast signal intrusion. It was never reported, mostly because everyone felt bad for him, and the next day, he was fired. He went off to live with his mother or something. I ain't hear much about it. His office was emptied, but he left a ton of tapes behind. I listened to a few of them out of curiosity. Some were the awfully heavy, degraded music. Others were sounds of conversations, TV, radio, and single records. It was eerie, like some sci-fi movie material. I nicked a few of the tapes for myself. They were just gonna throw them out in the dumpster anyway, so I took 2 of them, and I still have them. Anyways, I eventually became a DJ a year or 2 after Mr. Sellers was fired. It was a great gig. I started working the early mornings and later on moved up to 2 time slots with more listeners. Without Mr. Sellers, the place was quiet and normal. However, it was lacking creativity, and we were all pushed to our creative limits. Television was much more popular than radio, and we needed to give people a reason to listen. I was working one morning, and it happened again. It was between 5 or 6 in the morning, and I was drinking coffee to keep me awake during the end of my shift. I spoke occasionally on air, mostly introducing songs to a few listeners at the time. Some were getting up for their early paper route or were trucking. I knew my possible audience, so I played the best rock and roll I could find for them. I was listening to what was being broadcast through the headphones, and they began to click. It cut the sound out every other second, and then stopped, playing just dead air. I was tired and on a caffeine high. Every ghost story and horror cliche I knew played through my mind. My head started pounding, and I took my feet off the table. Suddenly it went to what sounded like a tape recording. I heard a chair squeak, like someone was sitting at a table. It sounded like someone had simply leaned forward in a chair. Of course, I almost had a meltdown. I didn't even think to hit the record button. Then it came back. There was a second of dead air and the sound of rock and roll once more. I was on edge until my shift ended. The sun was beginning to rise, and I calmed down the second I was out of that eerie station. There was just something about radio stations with all of the recording and broadcasting devices around you. One feels watched when they're alone, paranoid. Maybe it was just all the energy. I heard some energy can make people feel on edge. I reported the problem, but no one really cared. After about a day, neither did I. The last time I heard it happen was probably the worst. Once again, during my first year of being on air, I sat in the morning playing music. The second the sound cut off, I pressed record. It was cutting in and cutting out. I heard faint talking in with every cut. There was about 5 seconds of a tape being played backwards. I could actually hear the stop button being pressed and snapping upwards. Then I heard a chair squeak, very faintly. Once again, I only heard it the second time around. The last thing I heard was something that made me feel watched for weeks. I heard what I later decided to be Mr. Sellers' voice say, "It still works, Davy." Then it came back after a few clicking sounds. I was stunned. If you didn't already guess, Davy is what I've always been known by and called around at the station by coworkers. I called myself DJ D on the air because it seemed to be hip at the time and catchy. I played the recording over and over again. Each time it sent chills down my spine. I once played it while I was going to bed. It was next to another musical tape of mine, and I popped it into the stereo just for kicks. Even then, it freaked me out. About half a year after the last incident, I saw Mr. Sellers' obituary in the papers. He had fallen off of his mother's rooftop, and I was sure it was suicide, but then later I heard through the grapevine that he had gone up there one day in search of governmental satellites and had slipped off. His mother's gardener had found him dead a few hours after his mother had yelled at him for trying to cut open part of the wall and search for recording devices. She said he went outside in a terrible state of mind, and then he was dead. All just what I heard around the station, of course. Just like that, the man was dead. I listened to the other tapes that he had left behind many times. It was rather interesting to listen to odd snippets of his life. I even kept it with my music. However, the It Still Works tape is something I got rid of a long time ago. Not on purpose, but it was probably for the better. I have no idea what he meant by when he said that, and I still don't. It didn't mysteriously stop working or disappear. I was just so upset and bothered by the sound of him calling me out on air that I didn't keep it with my music anymore. I moved from one apartment to the other and ended up putting a few boxes in storage during the process. I emptied the contents of my unit except for a couple boxes I didn't care about. I stuffed a tape into a box of old scarves from my cousin and unused bedsheets from my dead grandmother. Then I realized that I didn't pay my storage bill one day, and I didn't care. I truly didn't care that I lost the tape. So either the owner of the rental place threw out the boxes or they auctioned them off. Even if some stranger listened to the tape, they would have no background and they wouldn't be freaked out like I was. The only result of this was that I never feel alone while recording. Sometimes the sudden memory of that damned voice of Mr. Sellers will pop into my head and send chills up my spine. Every accidental click or broadcast error on the radio makes me jump. I love being on the air, but sometimes, especially early in the morning, it's simply nightmarish. I'm not sure if I'm going mad myself, but one time, just a few months ago, I swear to the heavens, I heard the faint voice of Mr. Sellers saying that "It still works, Davy," underneath a low-quality transmission to a pre-recorded advertisement. I always listen for it now, and that only makes me more likely to hear it. Maybe it's just me, but that broadcast signal intrusion still freaks me